I grew up relatively privileged. This was my neighborhood, this was the park where I used to run, and this is my high school, the 25th best high school in the state of Georgia, according to niche.com. Not everyone has it great over there, but there are a lot of kids that are just like me, meaning privileged. I loved it there, to be honest. I had a lot of fun my last 2 years of high school. But like any place in America where there is a lot of privilege, of course, you guessed it, racism messed it up. The summer after my junior year of high school, I thought it would be funny to take a picture with a Confederate flag as like a sticking it to the man kind of event. Turns out it wasn't. And after the flurry of internet hate, I was left thinking, how is it that I'm 16, been in school for 12 years, know and feel the pain of racism every day, and yet still don't understand really how it works or what I can do to change it? Today, I want to answer that question. And in the process, I hope to illuminate a few things that we need to change about the way we teach race in public schools and make some suggestions on how we can do just that. In 1975, John E. Williams, Deborah L. Best, and Donna A. Boswell updated the preschool racial attitude measure, a test constructed to detect racial bias in preschool-aged children. In their landmark research, they found that in-group racial bias could be found in students as young as 3 and 4 years old, and that anti-black discrimination could be found in a disproportionate amount of students regardless of race. In fact, later research by Frances Abu and Annabeth Doyle, and more recently in research from the University of Toronto and in an updated version of the preschool racial attitude measure known as the Racial Attitudes Index, found that in-group racial bias could be found in infants as young as 6 to 9 months old. They also found that in elementary school children, racial bias peaks around the age of 6 before falling to a stable level by around the age of 9. There's a lot going on in a child's mind during this time, and our K-12 education system is designed to complement this development and shape it in a positive direction. How then do our schools teach about race and racial bias at a time when students are constructing their racial identity and later when they have a more firm understanding of it and are learning to live in the world with this knowledge? Let's take a look. In early elementary school, students learn for the first time about the Declaration of Independence, our civil rights heroes, the virtue of equality, and how in this country we celebrate our cultural differences. Later, we learn about segregation and the Civil War and how we often fail to live up to these ideals. The main message broadcast to elementary school students about race can be summed up in this single statement. Even though we don't always treat each other as equals, it's important to remember that we are still all equal. Well, once students understand this, there is a natural next question, which would be, why don't we treat each other as equals? This is where the problems begin. Instead of answering that question, in middle school and high school, we learn about slavery and abolition, segregation, Jim Crow, and the civil rights struggle, all important history. But what we do not learn, or even discuss, is how racism affects us in this country every day, today. We don't talk about the codification of white values into our legal and academic systems, or even explain what white privilege means. We don't talk about the ramifications of the GI Bill, or the Federal Housing Act, or redlining on who could and couldn't build generational wealth in this country. We don't talk about the war on drugs, or COINTELPRO, or our medical system's inability to adequately serve Black areas. And it's not that this question, why don't we treat each other as equals, doesn't have answers. As I just listed a small sample of, there are several specific, identifiable, and tangible levers that continue to perpetuate racism in this country. And it's not that these levers are difficult to comprehend either. For example, let's take a look at how I came to learn about the prison industrial complex. My freshman year of high school, I was listening to Kanye West's 6th studio album, Yeezus. In between claiming to be God, several times. On the song New Slaves, Kanye raps, meanwhile the DEA teamed up with the CCA. They trying to lock niggas up, they trying to make new slaves. I didn't know what the CCA was, but it took me all of 5 minutes to go on Rap Genius, find a short article from the American Civil Liberties Union, and have a pretty basic understanding of the prison industrial complex. I wanted to talk to my friends about it, but they didn't know what the CCA was either. So I went to some of the adults in my life, hoping that they would know more. And guess what? They didn't. That's not to say they didn't know something was wrong with the prison system. They knew something was up. They could even tell you that the problem was racialized. But what they could not tell you were the details of how race and the prison system work together they couldn't tell you how racism and incarceration were intertwined. This shadowy, abstract understanding of racism is a state that few Americans grow out of. We know racism is a problem, we know it exists, but we don't really know how it works or how we perpetuate it. And here's the problem with this. For Black people and other people of color, being denied an understanding of racism denies us the opportunity to effectively fight against it. And even worse, it keeps us from knowing how to cope with the pain that racism causes when we internalize it. For white people, it prevents them from understanding something they may never experience themselves or even actively discouraged from experiencing, and yet continues to exist and rip apart our society. Even worse, without ever understanding what causes racism, and after years without seeing or feeling its effects, there's a growing number of white adults who don't think that racism exists. And we have data on this. In a longitudinal study from Uma M. Jayakumar, published in the Harvard Educational Review, researchers found that the belief that racial bias is no longer a major factor in the United States today sees a 10% increase in white adults in their first 6 years out of college. This increase is observed regardless of the amount of diversity experienced to these adults during their time in early childhood or in college. In another study from Tufts University and the Harvard Business School, researchers found a gap in the way that Black and white adults perceive racial discrimination. Among white adults, there is a strong correlation between a decrease in anti-Black discrimination and an increase in anti-white discrimination, as if discrimination is this zero-sum game where a decrease on one end necessitates an increase on the other. This is a result of a lack of understanding of what causes racism, mixed with the more public efforts made to mitigate structural racism. The result, a minority but notable group of white adults who believe that efforts to curb structural racism in this country are overcompensating and have begun to discriminate against white people. I could go over many other ramifications of this way of thinking, but for the sake of brevity, let's just think about one. This May, I'll be graduating with 1,600 other brilliant minds. They'll go on to lead companies and make world-changing discoveries and be the force behind countless positive innovations. They'll work as political, scientific, social, and spiritual leaders wherever they end up, and their professional opinions will hold weight in matters that will affect thousands, if not millions of people. For the vast majority of my classmates, their race education ended with the incomplete curricula presented to them during their time in K-12 education. These leaders will be running for political office, filing lawsuits, writing legislation, and voting on topics that require some baseline knowledge of the system of race and power in the United States today. A baseline knowledge they do not have. A baseline knowledge that was kept from them. There's a reason that federal, local, and state governments continue to pass policy that perpetuates structural racism. There's a reason that it took until the year 2020 for a city in the United States to even attempt creating a reparations plan for its Black residents. There's a reason that it took the lawsuit against Harvard over affirmative action over 5 years to eventually get shut down. As long as our education system keeps us in the dark about the details of racial oppression, we're powerless to effectively fight against it. After the events of this summer, I saw a lot of this on social media. And I applaud you for stepping out of your comfort zone, as it's important to continue to learn about race and how it works in this country. So, lucky for you, I have some things everyone can start doing right now to start combating racism. First, for families and educators, I challenge you to begin to brush up on resources that explain what racism is and how it works, is start teaching your students what racism is, how it came to be, and how it is perpetuated. A quick Google search will help you find resources, but some that I would suggest include facinghistory.org's The Concept of Race, Ibram X. Kennedy's How to Be Anti-Racist, and PBS's Race, The Power of Illusion. Remember that there isn't some elixir to not being racist. Not being racist means making non-racist choices every day, and this baseline knowledge is the necessary roadmap needed to make those decisions. The earlier in your students' lives that they have this roadmap, the more natural making the right decision will feel. Second, for my students, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, don't settle for half-baked answers on racial questions. If something doesn't make sense to you, ask. Do your own research. Be respectful. Be curious. But most of all, don't let anyone disrespect your intellect. They're a lot more perceptive than a lot of adults like to give you credit for. and it's important that you don't let that be stifled. And finally, for my education policymakers, for those in charge of designing curricula, it means anyone from the good people at the College Board to local politicians and school board members to even Mr. Miguel Cardona. My plea to you is to take a serious look at the way race and power are intertwined in this country and begin to integrate that understanding into curricula and testing requirements. Ultimately, any changes we make to the way we teach kids about race in this country are in your hands. And it's important that we do a better job with the next generation than we've done with ourselves. Like any problem, racism won't go away if we just don't look at it. So let's stop using that strategy, and let's teach our kids to do the same. Thank you.